Okay, we're back. We're live. I'm Jay Fidel here on ThinkTech Global, which is really sort of the flagship of our Thursdays, 4 to 5 p.m. every Thursday, and we try to hit something very global, and usually we succeed. Today, our special guest is Edward Ned Shultz, PhD, Interim Chancellor of Hawaii Tokai International College. I get that right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you for coming on the show. You know, we've been covering a lot of education lately. It seems that education is in the air in Hawaii. You know, it's like an industry. Everything we touch has something to do, you know, with UH or with HPU was in here earlier, and kids in high school. And we just talked today with Robert Pennybacker, and he's running the Hikino program in the high schools. And then last week we did the science fair. All these kids. It seems like it's more important now than it was. And it seems like there are more people involved in it now than it was. So we're going to explore today your involvement in all of that.
You're talking to a person who's very biased in favor of education. And I think one of the hallmarks of the United States, going back to before you and I were born, was the importance of education. Even though at that point it was just for the elite, very early on we started a public school system, which we wanted to make it second to none. Now I don't know where we are, but
second, third, fourth.
Yeah. But you know, American education has always had a tremendous belief that if we're going to be a democracy, we have to have an educated citizenry. And I think that explains why there's so much interest. I just wish we could push it even further. And being a former professor, you always want to raise the level a little higher. And that's where I am. I'd just like to have us achieve even more, because our kids are potentially great. You saw the science fair last week, and these are young kids. And I mean, given the right tools, given the right impetus, they can do wonders. And that's what I think we have to constantly find a way to do it.
Yeah, constantly. And I mean, it's not just, you know, Hawaii, it's the world and everywhere. And I don't know why, but it comes back to me. We'll get on the track here in a minute. It comes back to me, you know, in 1776, or whenever they were meeting in Liberty Hall in Philadelphia. It was a big secret what was going on inside, and a woman was waiting outside. When they finally, you know, finished their meeting, she wanted to know what was going on. And Dr. Ben Franklin, walked out the door, and she caught him, and she said, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government are we going to have? Remember this line? And he said, a republic, madam, if you can keep it.
Yeah.
And, you know, you pay dues, and one of the dues you pay is education. And I think we see all over the world situations where, you know, the government was nicely conceived, but the people don't understand it, they don't back it up, they don't know how to participate. This is a risk, a huge risk in the world today. And
especially in our country. The fact that we have such an abysmally low voter registration is, to me, very, very dangerous.
Yes, dangerous, yes.
And I really look to the schools to try to instill in their students the importance of voting and getting out there. Otherwise, you're stuck with who we have, whoever it may be.
Yeah, and you know, if I had to pick, you can disagree with me, but if I had to pick, the one thing that I would like those kids to know when they come out of school is they're in a social compact.
Yeah.
And they got duties to people around them to keep things working right. And if they abandon that, if they ignore that, if they become disaffected and disconnected, they collectively risk the whole enterprise.
We talk about individualism, we talk about how the individual is really important, but the individual has to realize they're part of a society, and they have to work with that society.
So now that's elevated to an international concept, and that is really profoundly important in the world today, the 21st century. So how did you get into education then?
Well, I went to college.
As a beginning?
Actually, I went to high school, kindergarten. No, I finished college a long time ago, maybe before you were born, and I joined the Peace Corps. And I was...
Never met anybody in the Peace Corps I didn't like.
Well, there's always the first time. And I was sent to Korea. And the reason I was sent to Korea, because when I was an undergraduate in college, I had studied Chinese. And I said I'd like to go someplace where I could use my Chinese. And from the Washington mentality, Korea, China, that's all pretty close together. The languages must be similar. So I went to Korea and promptly learned a whole new language. And when I finished with Peace Corps, I was an English teacher, high school English teacher. I came back to, actually I trained in Hawaii, in Hilo. And I wanted to go into Korean studies because that's where I was.
That was the training in Hilo, yeah?
Yeah, right.
It's very important.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to say when that happened, but it was before I was born.
Before you were born,
Yeah.
exactly. No, we were there in '66, if you need a date. And it was, I mean, what a great place to train in Hilo. And just the aloha spirit was alive and well. And the Hilo people were so kind to the Peace Corps volunteers because they kind of appreciated what we're trying to do as service for the country. Little did they realize we're actually doing service for ourselves, but it was service for the country. And so when I finished training and finished my Peace Corps period, I wanted to go to grad school in Korean studies. And Hawaii was clearly the best. Harvard had one person, Columbia had one person, Hawaii had 5. And because I'd grown up on the East Coast, I thought I'd like to try something different. And so I came to Hawaii for grad school.
What is Korean studies? I mean, what is studies for a given country? What do you
So
learn?
what you do, we have at the University of Hawaii lots of studies. We have Japanese studies, Chinese studies, Philippine studies. And it's really a combination of looking at that country, that culture from any number of different aspects. I happen to be a historian, so I really looked at Korea from a historical perspective.
I never met an historian I didn't like either.
Whoa. This is anyway.
Okay.
and so essentially, I focused from the historical perspective. But if you study history, or at least we historians believe, you have to really know literature, you have to know language, you have to know society. And that's what Korean studies is all about, just looking at Korea from any number of different areas. And because we have a fairly significant Korean community, early on there was a commitment to study Korea. And that's why we had 5 faculty studying Korea, whereas all the other big ones had only 1. And so very quickly, Hawaii became a leader in Korean studies, and it still is today. It's still probably the best place to go.
Interesting. In the world? Or in the country?
Well, the Koreans would claim they're the best place to go in the world. Well, I mean, we have good competition. In 1967, 1970, we had competition, but not really good competition. Now we have good competition. Harvard's built up their program. UCLA's built up their program. A couple of other schools have built up theirs. But Hawaii still clearly leads.
And, just thinking aloud about history, you study, if you're a historian and you're going through school, majoring in history, for example, I'm minored in American history. You learn American history, that's what you learn. But then now you start learning, say, Korean studies, and you're learning, as part of that, you're learning Korean history. What's it like? I guess I have my answer.
Questions from the audience?
It's a question. Stop everything. But it must be an interesting experience to have your framework in American history, and then to have, say, Korean history, which began long before American history, and then subconsciously pinning, history is all about chronology, so pinning American history events on Korean events, vice versa. What's that like? What kind of experience was it for you?
Well, we, as Americans, approach the world from an American vantage. And so often we'll look at things and we'll think of them in terms of the American experience. Just to give you one example, you may recall the Eyes on the Prize. That was the whole idea. There was a series of films back on PBS back in the 70s or 80s about spreading civil rights and the fact that you needed to be really activists. If you just laid back, civil rights would never come. Well, I was looking at Korea's history, and they had a dictatorship at one time, and now they're a democracy. And basically, it became clear to me, without fighting for that democracy, they weren't going to get it. And so I was able to bring that perspective into Korean history. And I kept on telling my friends, you got to look at this documentary, and that'll help give you a roadmap for how you get democracy in Korea. I don't think any of them ever looked at the movie, but I think there's those kinds of connections that you do see.
They had their own version of Ben Franklin too, I'm sure.
They've had a number of Bens. Electricity, I don't know, but they did. They had a number. Yeah, they sure did.
So what happened after Korean studies?
Pardon?
What happened after Korean studies?
Oh,
for
after
you?
Korean studies, well, I always joke that whenever a school graduates somebody they really shouldn't have a degree, they keep them nearby so they don't go out and cause embarrassment. So
No degree for you.
well, I gave me the degree, but don't leave Hawaii.
Okay,
That's what
okay.
they did. Don't show the world what we produced. So I actually went off as soon as I graduated. I taught initially at Leeward Community College for a semester, and then West Oahu started. And I went out there and taught at West Oahu for about 20 years. Dan Boylan, you may recall, he and I were both sort of founding members of the West Oahu campus. And following that, I came to Manoa, where I was the director of the Center for Korean Studies, and then stayed on in the Asian Studies department. And again, they were looking for somebody who wouldn't mess things up too much, so they asked me to become dean. So I was a dean of the School of Pacific and Asian Studies for about 7 or 8 years.
This is a very important school.
Oh yeah, definitely. No, definitely. Again, we talk about Hawaii's excellence, and we know we're tops in astronomy. We know we're tops in foreign and Asian languages, and Pacific and Asian Studies is just one of our grand.
How do you measure being top in Asian studies?
Well, we tell everybody.
Do a lot of writing.
Do a lot of writing. What do your faculty produce? Where do your students go afterwards? And then we have these national competitions in which the federal government will provide funding for programs. And we've consistently ranked right up in the top of all those. In Southeast Asian studies, for example, we're in the top 5. Pacific Island studies, we're the only one. East Asian studies, we're roughly in the top 15. But of the top 15, we're probably in the top 5. So that's one way to get validation off campus.
You know, in your career anyway, the U.S., well, the world has become globalized.
Yeah.
And certainly we're more interested in Asia now than we were 20 years ago. And so Hawaii must have strategically even a more important place than it did back when, simply because of the, what do we call it, the Thomas Friedman effect.
Yeah, yep, definitely.
And I wonder how that visits the UH. I mean, do you have students who come from more dispersed, diverse places? Do you have scholars who visit from more diverse places? What kind of center is it now these days?
Interestingly, when Hawaii first went big into Asian studies, that was back in the 20s and the 30s. We already were teaching Japanese and Chinese. And then our actual study centers begin about 1970, 75. And the competition wasn't great then. As I mentioned before, in Korea's case, we had 5, whereas Harvard, Columbia, Washington, Berkeley had 1. Those other schools have now caught on, and so there's more competition. We still lead the pack, but there is more competition in that respect, which is good because that makes us be more careful about who we are.
Yeah.
East West Center was and still is a tremendous asset to the University of Hawaii. They bring in scholars, they bring in students, and in many respects they're the frosting on the cake for our programs. And so it's just a wonderful melting of the two institutions that are merging. I don't want to say melting, that's a better wonderful merging of the of the two institutions. And I think that helps us maintain excellence. Then there's the fact that who in their right mind wouldn't want to come to Hawaii? And so scholars are very frequently very pleased to be invited to come out to give a talk or to visit, especially in the winter months. And so that helps our appeal.
Because international studies of any kind is going to have at least as much and probably more exchange with other countries, simply because of the international quality program.
Yep. And the exchange, of course, again, was enhanced by the fact that the East West Center in the 60s and the 70s was just bringing in so many students from overseas. And so if you wanted to get an insight into what was going on in Asia, you could come here and find all sorts of young students from those countries. And now today it redounds to our benefit because those very people who came here in the 60s, 70s, and 80s have gone back and are true leaders. Right. And I was talking with Charles Morrison the other day about the importance of the East West Center as a leadership place where they train or try to develop leaders. And I said, well, Charles, and he agreed, we've been doing this in the 60s and the 70s. We just did it with soft power, and now we're doing it much more directly.
It was organized during the Vietnam War.
Exactly.
So now you begin to understand the international quality of these programs. You begin to understand, you know, the background that Ned Shultz has, and after this break, we're going to connect that up. We're going to find out what happened between, you know, at the Pacific Asian Studies program, it got to Tokai. And we're going to see where Tokai fits in this in this constellation of international education in Hawaii. We'll be right back. You'll see.
Hi, I'm your host on ThinkTech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, ThinkTech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Right, here we go. We're back. We're live with Ned Shultz, PhD, Interim Chancellor of Hawaii Tokai International College. And it just so happens, you know, that, well, for a long time in my life, I lived down the block from Tokai on Kapiolani Boulevard at, where was it, McCulley Street, right near there. It had its back on the park, and there was a lot of room and activity there. So tell us, how did you connect with, well, what is Tokai and how did you connect with it?
All right. Well, Hawaii Tokai International College was actually founded in Hawaii. I mean, it was actually founded in Japan in the 1930s. And it was founded by some very forthright thinking people. And remember, the 30s in Japan was a time when war clouds were looming. And this founder said, we can do better. We need to work on our international perspective. And so he started Tokai, what's called today the Tokai Educational System. And he started this small school with the idea of trying to promote more international engagement. Well, the war came, the war left, and he continued to work on building the Tokai system. And so today in Japan, Tokai University has roughly 30,000 students, and it has feeder campuses, high schools across the country. But besides what they're doing in Japan, they also had outreach in Vienna, Austria, in Denmark. And then in the 90s, the founder said, we need to go to Hawaii and try to start something there. And so they founded this campus in 1992, and they built it up. For a number of years, they maybe had 100 to 125 students. And the whole idea was to serve, Hawaii Tokai International College was to serve as a gateway, primarily for Japanese kids to enter American higher education. It's also, though, today, well, so it became accredited, and it's still an accredited American junior college, freshmen and sophomores. And so students come in from Japan and other countries, and they'll get their AA degrees, and then they'll move on either back to Japan or on to American universities. And we send a number of students to Manoa, and of course, with our move, we hope to send a number of students to West Oahu as well. So it's a gateway for Japanese students. And as I say, we're trying to bring in more students from other parts of the world. And so it becomes a gateway into America. In the same token, we're trying to develop a Discover East Asia program. in which we focus on Korea, China, and Japan for American students, for local students to come to Tokai.
Is that in existence now?
Yeah, yeah, it's in existence now. We have
This is a great thing.
yeah, so it's, the whole idea is American students, Hawaii students in particular, they come here, they work and live with students from Asia, and then they go on to Asia.
Oh, so it's a step one, step two.
Yeah.
First, they have contact with the Asian students.
Here.
And then they go.
And then they go.
That's perfect. You know, I mean, sometimes people come to me, not that I'm an expert on this, and they say, what should I tell my kid after he finishes high school or college? And I say, go to Asia.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's, you know, it's where the world is going now. It's a safe and comfortable place usually.
Yeah.
And it will teach him another language, and it will make him a citizen of the world. And we cannot afford to be other than that.
Yep. Yeah. And the younger they go, the quicker they're going to pick up the language.
That's true. Yeah.
My brother asked me the same question back in the 90s, and I said exactly the same thing. He was living on the East Coast, so he sent his poor son to Russia.
I might not have suggested that, but hey.
Well, now the son's a Russian expert. He's bilingual.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
But he's stuck in Russia.
And Russia's in the news plenty, so.
But as you said, I would say China, Japan, Korea.
Yeah.
That's where our future is.
So I don't know if the founder's name was Tokai or that's the name
No,
of the place.
Matsumai. Matsumai.
Matsumai.
Yeah.
You know, but what was the original concept way back even before the war? You have a little thing.
Just to give you, that's the son. The founder has now gone on, but
He saw a global operation.
Yeah. And he really felt Japanese in particular needed to be alert to the international world. And he was a liberal individual. He was opposed to the war. He had to keep his mouth shut during the war, otherwise he would have been imprisoned. But he never gave up on that dream. And so in 1992, he was still alive. And so he came out and brought his son, and they purchased the land, built the building, and made this their outreach.
Yeah, that was pretty visionary.
Oh yeah,
back when,
you know, when you think, you know, the war's coming on, the war clouds are there, Japan's already invaded China, and yet this man is trying to say, hey, there's another answer.
Yeah, and well, he's saying the opposite
Exactly,
of what was
yeah.
going on. He was trying to drive the other way.
Yeah.
But I think it was visionary in the sense that it's a better world if people are international. It's a better world on citizen diplomacy. It's a better world on economics. It's better on the arbitrage of cultures and all that. And I think
also
that,
just living. If you know more than one culture, your life is so much richer.
True? Isn't that true? And your life is better. Your frame of reference in the world is better. And somehow, these guys, Tokai and other schools from abroad, say up until maybe 2000 or so, they knew it better than we did. They were more international. Look at the Chinese, they were all over the U.S. before the U.S. ever woke up to the issue.
Except Hawaii.
Right, okay. But to me,
Yeah.
this is a truism that we have to get on board with, and Hawaii has an advantage because of places like Tokai.
Hawaii also has an advantage because of our history, and we're, aside from Native Hawaiians, and even they immigrated in 2,000 years ago, but essentially much of our population came in the last 200 years. And they have this sense of being rooted here, but also there's links elsewhere. And I think that makes it easier for our folks to go to Asia, and it certainly makes it easier for people from Asia to come here.
Yeah, travel is broadening.
Yeah, travel is broadening, and you really have to thank the original Hawaiian culture also, because it was so welcoming, it was so open, and almost to a deficit, because they suffered because of their openness.
Yeah.
And yet they never really have ever given up being open and
Deeply
welcoming.
ingrained,
Yeah.
and it's something we can build on now.
Yeah. And I think when students come from overseas, they're really touched by that. Well, just like my experience, I came from overseas to Hilo, and people were so overwhelmingly kind and generous.
Yeah.
And it's something which we really have to continue.
We, including the people who came in, were treated well. We have the greatest duty of all, don't we?
Yes, yes.
So, okay, so somewhere this crosses your radar.
Yeah, I was, by this point, I was over at Manoa, and they have a board of trustees. And Danny Kwok had been sort of the
I know
Manoa.
Danny Kwok,
Yeah, okay,
yeah.
another historian.
China seminar.
Yeah, exactly, another historian. And he had been on their board, and he felt he had been on the board long enough. And so they needed somebody to sort of step in. And they asked me if I would consider being on the board of trustees. And I said, oh, yeah, sure, because I've studied Japan, I've lived in Japan, you know, I've lived in Korea. So it was an easy thing to do. And so I've been on the board since 1998. And this year, the former chancellor was being recalled back to Japan to do some work in Japan, and they desperately needed somebody to fill in his shoe in his departure. And I was in Korea at the time. This was the discussion last year, and they basically said, Ned, you're going to come back from Korea. What are you going to do? You're retired. Wouldn't you consider being a interim chancellor? And after some discussion, we agreed, okay, I'll be the interim chancellor for just maybe 9 months. And we're doing a search right now for a new chancellor.
So interim chancellor, does that necessarily lead to chancellor?
Well, the UH model usually does.
Sure does, yeah.
But I made it very clear, I'm interim.
Yeah.
I have a lot of other things to do than be an administrator. You know,
Yeah.
so
It's different, being an administrator.
yeah, your time is not your own. Yeah. Faculty have a wonderful. Faculty work hard, but they're really much more masters of their own time.
Yes, and their own idealism.
And they can sort of say what they want to say,
And they do.
and they do, for better or worse. But chancellors, you know, academic administrators have to think you're part of the institution, and so you can't always speak out as much as you'd like.
Now, did the people that you talked with at Tokai University notice that you were Howley?
Oh yeah, I mean it's pretty clear.
I mean, how does that work? I mean,
They also
Tokai-
noticed that I was a Korea specialist.
So the two taken together,
Oh.
that's had a pretty good product.
No, so they were aware that I'd been dean at Manoa, and they were aware I'd been an assistant vice chancellor for international education at Manoa, and they also were aware that I had worked with the Tokai board for 12, 14 years. So I was very much aware of what they were trying to do, and they figured I couldn't do too much damage for 9 months, and so that's why I'm currently the interim chancellor.
Okay, but this is a critical period, though.
Actually, it turns out it is, because you know you're giving up this building that's right down in the heart of
It's a nice building,
Kapilani.
actually.
It's really a wonderful location, and we're moving out to West Oahu, and our highest building at West Oahu is 2 floors, and so you're going from a 19-floor totally enclosed campus to one that's much more spread out, and only 2 floors to deal with. But I really like the feel of the new campus.
So there'd be open spaces and green
exactly.
grass. And
Green
all that.
grass, and they're doing a tremendous job putting in the landscaping right now, and grass is growing, and we walk across, we basically share a parking lot with UH West Oahu. And you walk across the parking lot in the UH West Oahu campus, and we have our cafeteria there. We have access to their library. We have a library, they have a library, and so we're really looking forward to a great deal of interaction.
And that's the partnership you described. I mean, after all, did I mention we're calling this a new partnership?
A new
with
partnership,
Tokai.
yeah, exactly.
But what is the nature of it? I mean, you know, we hear about public-private partnerships. We hear about partnerships, all kinds.
Mhm.
Here's a public, or rather an educational partnership. What's that like? What are the terms of a partnership like that?
Well, I wish I could tell you concretely because we're just starting.
Yeah.
But really what we're envisioning is, because West Oahu has very few international students, and they really would like to internationalize their curriculum. And we have very few local students, and we would like to internationalize our curriculum. And so we're hoping that we'll have a greater merger of students and greater contact across the campuses. There's a number of ways we're going to try to do that. We're opening, our classes are all lower division, freshman, sophomore. But West Oahu students will be able to take our classes if they wish. We also have a fairly significant English language, teaching the English language component, which West Oahu doesn't. And so if West Oahu brings in international students who need to improve their English, they'll be able to go there to our classes and work on that.
Multiple synergies.
Yeah, yeah. We teach Japanese, Chinese, Korean language. West Oahu doesn't. So again, if their students want that kind of interaction, they can come.
I'm sure they will more and more.
And by the same token, West Oahu has a lot of courses that we don't offer. And so if we can open up there, and I'm pretty sure that basically we want to open our curriculum up to each other. So it's sitting in class, studying, working with students is one way. There's also the whole idea of the shared cafeteria. And anything goes in the cafeteria, so.
That leads to better education.
Yeah.
It does.
No, it does. And then clubs. Our clubs are all open to them, to the West Oahu students, and their clubs are open to our students. So that's another way.
So you want to make this as integrated as you possibly can.
Yeah.
One moment for a break. Ned Shultz, PhD, Interim Chancellor of Hawaii Tokai International College, here on ThinkTech Global, a new partnership for Tokai, namely the one with West Oahu campus. We'll be right back.
Aloha, my name is Paul Jackson, better known as PJ,
now?
and my local interest is in sports.
A sports
I have my
program
own sports radio show at KWAI AM 1080 that you can stream live. I also have my own website, pjsportsradio.com. We have live guests in studio, and we talk about discussions and topics that everyone wants to know locally here on the islands. We cover everything from surfing to basketball to whatever's going on locally, sports-wise. We try to do our best and cover the topics in depth as much as we can. Once again, thank you for joining PJ here on Hawaii Sports Update. Mahalo.
Hi, aloha. My name is Chris Leatham, and I host a show called The Economy and You. The show plays every Wednesday at noon, and on my show, I bring on guests who are interested or working in the technology space. And so I'd like you to come and watch the show and learn with me about all the sort of exciting things that we're doing in Hawaii to build and grow our economy ecosystem. So I'd like to say aloha, and I look forward to seeing you on the show. Thank you.
Okay, we're back. We're live with Ned Shultz, Interim Chancellor of Hawaii Tokai International College, which is in the process of moving and building in West Oahu and establishing a new partnership for Tokai with West Oahu here on ThinkTech Global. So, I mean, this represents more than the sum of its parts, don't you think? We have education, you know, education in Hawaii has been a little fits and starts lately with the, what I call it, the proximity of the Manoa campus with the square building. That is not a recipe for growth. But, you know, ultimately, as we discussed earlier, education is an industry of major import here and everywhere, and it is the key to Dr. Franklin's problem.
Yes.
So how do you see this unfolding, the international aspect of it, between what we have here now, what you're going to do in West Oahu, what you're going to, the arrangement you're going to forge out there, and the whole international prospect?
Hawaii, and I really can't speak highly enough about Hawaii, because from early on there's been a tremendous commitment to the university. And of course, not as much as we want today, but there's a lot of other forces that need to be addressed. But I think the whole idea of West Oahu and Tokai coming together started about 5 years ago, when Tokai realized that if they wanted to expand, they wanted to grow, that current building wasn't sufficient. And so where was the room to expand? Well, where's everything going but to the West Oahu area? And so at that time, Gene Aokuni, who was the Chancellor of West Oahu, and Naoto Yoshikawa, who was the Chancellor of Tokai, sat down and started to talk. Well, how do we do this? And they brought in, then it was Marcy Greenwood, and the head of the Tokai system in Japan, and collectively we signed an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that they were going to, West Oahu was going to, the Tokai was going to build. And Tokai went on to buy 6 acres of land at $1 million an acre. And that money West Oahu used to build some of their buildings, maybe half a building. But that sort of started the whole move. And roughly 3 or 4 years ago, there was a groundbreaking. And we looked at the West Oahu buildings, and they were designed by John Hara, and we felt that our buildings should be, should work
Consistent,
consistent,
yeah.
And so John came in and designed our buildings, and
Good idea.
John, as I say, it was a cane field, and so, well, our students will probably raise cane, but essentially that theme is there in the structure of the buildings. And John Hara claims that basically he was thinking of the sugar plantation factories when he laid the buildings out.
We should remember.
Yeah, but the nice thing is, because John has grown up in Hawaii and he knows we have these wonderful trade winds, he built, at least in the West Oahu point of view, these buildings that really pick up the trades. And in the common areas, the trades just blow right through. Oh yeah, it's really quite pleasant. You don't need air conditioning all over.
Save money.
And for Hawaii Tokai, he really worked in making us LEED, and so we are LEED Gold standard, or almost at. I mean, we're in the application for LEED Gold standard.
That's great.
Photovoltaic is coming in, so we're going to have completely full photovoltaic systems. The roofs are built so that they can capture the photovoltaic.
Yeah. The maximum time of day. And all that.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why they've told us we're going to get the gold standard for that. So we're really happy about that, because sustainability is important. It is crucial.
Education should do that. It's a matter of being
exactly,
enlightened.
Exactly. Make that part of their education.
Yeah.
And so with all of that going in, we did start the move last week, and we're going to have our formal opening on the 17th. We're going to have an open house on May 2nd, and so if you want to go out to the cane fields, Saturday the 2nd of May.
It's a pleasant ride, actually, if you're not in a traffic time.
Yeah, as long as the zipper lanes work.
Yeah, right.
It's not bad. You can make it from downtown here in probably half an hour if you go at, say, 10 in the morning. And it's going to be on Saturday at 10 in the morning, so you could do it if
Might
you
do that.
10 to 12 on the
Bring my
Saturday
camera.
2nd. Yeah, bring your camera, and we'll even give you a cup of coffee
Thank you.
if you make it out there. But that's where the community can come in and look at what's
So
been
the
built.
buildings are built now.
Buildings are built. We have dormitory space for 200 plus students. And West Oahu is supposed to be building dorms also, because the state gets bogged down and goes off in tangents. Those buildings haven't come yet, but that's the long-range goal. And then the whole idea is that our students would use West Oahu dorms, and West Oahu students would use our dorms. Again, the whole idea of enhancing interaction.
Yeah.
And I mean, what better way to learn Japanese than living with a bunch of kids who speak Japanese just naturally?
And these relationships are lifelong.
Exactly.
You know, I'm reminded of the APCSS, the Asia Pacific Center for Security
Right.
Studies at Fort Tarusi. And they invite and pay for, DOD money, they pay for various middle management and sometimes upper management people to come from Asia and take courses with them. It's all educational. And when they come, you know, they get to stay in condos in Waikiki, but they're always mixed up, always mixed up. And the result is those relationships are relationships that would never otherwise happen.
Exactly.
And they last forever.
They continue on.
Yeah.
And that, in many respects, is what the East West Center is and was all about also.
Yes.
Because you'd get, 10 students to a suite, and they'd come from all these different countries, and they bond, and then the friendships continue.
I'm beginning to see it. You know, you're entering into a community, Ned, entering into a community of international education. I mean, it's the East West Center, it's APCSS, and we have this ThinkTech Downtown Civic Forum, CSIS. And we have, these elements. We have a large community of retired diplomats, retired military, well familiar with Asia. So we have experts here. And now we're going to have kids who are, integrated and who are well able to understand the bridge to Asia. This is going to, I don't want to take words out of your mouth,
but that's
this is
exactly
going to take us to a new place.
I mean, friendships made when you're in college with a student from another country. You go to that country later, they'll show you the country that nobody can ever see unless it's a local person doing it. Right. When I was assistant vice chancellor at Manoa, I would always tell the international students, when you come in, make friends with local students. Don't come here and speak Chinese to each other or Norwegian to each other. Go out and meet local folks, because these will be your friends for life. And similarly, when American students, when our students who go to Japan or Korea or wherever they go, I say, make it your issue, make it your point of view to live as much as you can in that country and not with your other fellow students from Hawaii.
And it isn't only for psychic benefit. I mean, I don't know if studies have been conducted, you might know, about the earning capacity of people who speak another language, especially an Asian language, especially Chinese these days. And you know, their familiarity with the culture and history and so forth, as opposed to somebody who doesn't. I bet you, if you look in the job market, you will find that somebody with those skills, that experience, the language knowledge, is worth more. Simple, it's worth more.
If our people, say, can go and negotiate in the language of that country, it gives us just so much more of an advantage. And it's
negotiate anything. It's business, it's who knows what.
Yeah. But so often we demand it all be done in English. Yeah. And because we think it gives us an advantage, but it gives them an advantage too, because they all speak English.
So I just wonder what you must be out recruiting, right? Am I right about this? How many seats do you have? How many seats are covered? How many seats do you want to fill? And how do you do that?
We're constantly recruiting.
Okay.
What's really interesting is that a lot of people in Hawaii are not aware, one, that we exist, and two, that we're a fully accredited American junior college. And so we just hired a young man who is going to really go to all the high schools and let them know what the advantages of a Tokai education might be, and really pushing the whole idea that discover East Asia. But even if you don't want to discover East Asia, if you just want to sort of have a truly international education, Tokai is one way to look at it. We give good scholarships to local students, as long as they maintain a good GPA. What I mean, so essentially, we're on a quarter system right now, and so it's basically $4,000 a quarter. So for 3 quarters, that would be $12,000.
Not that expensive.
And then if you maintain a high GPA, you can get 50% off and whatnot. So it's an incentive to entice our local students, but it's also an incentive, of course, for them to do well. So that's one way in which we're recruiting. We're also really anxious to bring in more students from Korea, more from China. Our Japanese students again and again say they like HTIC, but there's too many Japanese. You know, and you know, from our perspective, we want to learn Japanese, it's great. But from their perspective, they'd like to see a greater integration with other people.
It all speaks well. It speaks well for Hawaii. It speaks well for education. It speaks well for, you know, sort of the global process. And what strikes me, if I were 16, in my mind I still am, what really strikes me is for an American student anyway, it's a pathway to Asia. It's a, you know, you can say that this gives a pathway to the Japanese who come over here since way back when, so they can enter the American university system, but it also gives a pathway for the American high school kid who wants to have a new life, a new prospect, a new global image, become a citizen diplomat, what you name it, all the great things in the world, make the world a better place. By doing that, it gives him a pathway. And you're making that possible.
Oh, you're kind, but when you think, when we were in our youth, we had very few opportunities like this. And now today, there's so many different avenues you can take. If you wanted to go study Chinese, President Barack Obama is trying to find, what, 100,000 kids to go study Chinese? There's money there.
There is money there. It's not just for love. You know, but I just wonder what happens to you after your time as Interim Chancellor. Are you, this is my closing question for you, actually, Ned. After Interim Chancellor, you know, your time expires. You by your own decision, you'll move along. You're going to go back in the Peace Corps?
Oh, that's an interesting question. You know, actually, I spent last year in Korea, sort of in the Peace Corps. I was a college teacher for a year.
It's very similar.
Very similar to what the Peace Corps, except it was at a much more luxurious level than when I was in the Peace Corps. Now, my wife and I still have a lot of travels to do, and that's one of the things. We have grandchildren that have to be watched, at least according to my children, they have to be watched. We are looking at different opportunities to maybe go and live in Asia for a short term, maybe 3 months in different places. And we enjoy Asia, but we love Hawaii. So it's hard to stay away too long.
We should all think that way, actually. That's Ned Shultz, PhD, Interim Chancellor of Hawaii Tokai International College in West Oahu now, forging a new partnership for Tokai with West Oahu here on ThinkTech Global. Thank you so much, Ned.
Yeah, thank you, Jay.
Aloha, sheshe, saijian.
Saijian.
That last part was great.